Now we're live.
Wonderful.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ZAPD FEDSA talks. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very happy this evening to have a talk from Alfi Oloo, and he's going to be talking to us about the importance of mentorship, amongst other things. And so I'm going to hand over to Alfi, and I hope you enjoy the talk.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's really good to be here. For those of you tuning in on live, I'm glad to have you. And feel free as we go through to drop your questions in the comments, or I think we're going to answer a couple of them at the end. But I know sometimes it's difficult to actually keep the question in your mind until the end. So please, as they sort of come up, put them in the chat, and we'll address as many of them as we can get to. So yeah, just a little bit about, I'll tell you a little bit about me and then I'll dive into things. I won't go on that much about myself just because I think we've got a lot of interesting stuff to cover today. But as you can see on the screen, I'm a product designer. I work at a smart tech company. I specialize in design systems. So that's kind of like my day job or my daytime hat. But outside of that, I also run a podcast, the Edit and Do podcast, where we chat to creatives from all different walks. But really, my heart is in the place of what we're going to be discussing today, and that's the domain of mentorship. And so I'll sort of leave it there. I think if you want to know more about me, you can catch me on on all the different socials. But I think I want us to dive right into things. And so, I'd like everyone who is listening in, whether you're listening live or listening afterwards, to take a deep breath before we get started. And I'd like you to imagine, for a moment, forget that you're seated, whether you're at home, at the office, walking in between things. Forget everything around you for a moment. And instead, imagine a doorway. And as you step through that doorway, you feel the desert sands underneath your feet. And behind you, you look over the great sand dunes of the Egyptian Empire. And before you, you raise your eyes to this great monolith that you have been a part of bringing into this world. And you think for a moment that it would be such a shame if the knowledge that raised this dedication to human ingenuity were lost forever. And so you decide to put down all the knowledge that you've learned, all the mathematics, the geometry, the physics that has been employed to put this together. You write it down on your family's last piece of papyrus to preserve this knowledge. Or maybe, instead, you decide to work every day to ensure that these great pyramids get finished within your lifetime so that you can look on them. And when your time eventually comes, that knowledge dies with you and is lost to humanity forever. Or maybe, imagine instead, we fast forward 25 centuries and you're a librarian. And before you stands a massive shelf with parchments, papyruses, paintings, and poetry, a store of humanity's knowledge and culture. Imagine you're a librarian in the great library of Alexandria, and at the time, the biggest library that has ever been built and the biggest in the world. And you decide that this knowledge is so valuable and so intrinsic to cultural development and human knowledge that you decide to send it across the world to different areas to ensure that should anything happen, it wouldn't be lost because it is so, so valuable. Or maybe instead, you decide that because it is so valuable, you can't share it. You decided to keep it because it is valuable and because it is precious, and because even just a single book might have been worth a king's ransom. And one fateful day, all of this knowledge is lost in the burning of the Library of Alexandria. And this great tragedy sets humanity back almost 10 decades in their cultural development. But the question is, why does all this matter? I mean, if we stop imagining for a second, we are a bunch of designers, developers, general product people. Why do these questions matter to us today? And I'd like us to think about that, but think about it from a different perspective. Maybe we should be asking ourselves, what might a better world look like? There's something quite interesting that about human progress and the storage of that human progress. If you were born in the year 1903, you'd have been alive during man's first flight and living only 66 years. You'd have also been on man's first landing on the moon. And that's what development can do within a single lifetime. And especially around where, in the point in time that we live and that we exist, the rate of growth and development is so steep that we can't afford to lose knowledge. Because if simply one lifetime took people from the first manned flight to the first moon landing, what would 10 decades of lost knowledge have resulted in the modern day? And so this problem of passing knowledge down from one generation to the next is a challenge that we are facing, and it has never been more relevant, simply because of the rate of change of both our industry, but the world in general. And so I want you to think about a problem that calls to you. When you do have that extra time, when you do have a moment to yourself, reflect. And I did the same thing. I asked myself, which problem actually calls to me? If we look at all the knowledge in the world, what actually draws me out? And for me, it has always been this idea of learning and of knowledge. And for those of you listening who know me, you would already know that me and my the education system have had a somewhat rocky relationship. And so I was a self-taught student. And it's given me an appreciation for how knowledge is actually learned and passed on. And so when I asked myself this question about knowledge being passed on, what our education system does at the moment, I sort of went back and looked at this problem over history and asked myself, how in the past has humanity dealt with this? Before the computers, before Google, before hard drives, before books, how has humanity been addressing this challenge? And there are three things that I found of particular relevance that brought me to the idea of mentorship. The first is the idea of the parent-child relationship. This is one of the core foundational ideas or core foundational frameworks that allow knowledge and information to be passed from one generation to the next. And I mean, it's the validity or its value is evident in the fact that it exists across our species, regardless of the species. There is some sort of relationship. With some, it's way shorter than with others, but it's consistently there. And so we can look a little bit at the parent-child relationship and learn a little bit about how knowledge is passed down in that environment. But then as humanity sort of developed and the idea of specialized crafts became the foundational economic structure, the idea of guilds and apprenticeship became this new model that allowed for learning. And lastly, We can also look at the modern schooling system. And what I'd like us to do today is take these three frameworks and look at them through the same lens and see what lessons we can learn from each one of them, and then look at what that actually means in the mentorship and developmental relationships we have in the modern day. And it all starts with this idea of the zone of proximal development. And this is the lens that I'd like us to use with each one of these learning models or developmental frameworks. And the idea was introduced by a great psychologist from the Soviet Union called Lev Vygotsky. Now, he died very young, but this was one of the great contributions he made. And I'm not a psychologist, as I sort of mentioned. I'm neither also a biologist. I'm not a doctor or anything of that kind. But I'd like to pull ideas from each one of those spaces to help tell this story. And the zone of proximal development is the first one. And it can be explained like this, put very simply. Each person has got a domain of mastered knowledge, the things that are within their capability. They don't necessarily need that much attention, and they can pretty much be relied on with muscle memory. Right. And if you think about this in the context of a baby, it's pretty much just crawling, crying, and getting in all kinds of trouble. And that's sort of what they can do from the earliest stages. And then there's this huge, span around that of things that you're yet to learn, things that you can't necessarily do yet. And these are high-risk activities because we don't know if we're capable of actually, overcoming them. And so the idea that Lev Vygotsky introduced can be explained by looking a little bit at neuroscience. Now, I'm going to explain this in very, very mundane terms, just so that we can have a working knowledge, but it'll be enough to give us a clear idea of how it actually affects our learning and our development. You see, there are two important brain systems that we employ in how we deal with risk and challenges. The first is the prefrontal cortex, and that's pretty much what separates us from most other animals. Our prefrontal cortex, you can almost think about it as the processing engine. It's where we do a lot of abstraction. It's where we do intense calculations and a lot of the conscious activity. And then you get the amygdala, which is almost like our threat detection system. It's more the emotional center of the brain. And I think a lot of us will be familiar with the idea of fight or flight. And so the fight or flight response is essentially when the amygdala takes over from the prefrontal cortex, because the amygdala manages a lot of the hormones that regulate how we respond to risk and to danger. And so if you've ever been in the situation where you're doing public speaking, or you're in front of a big crowd, maybe it's a dinner party, and suddenly your palms start to get a little bit sweaty, your mouth gets a little bit dry, your pupils dilate. This is essentially the amygdala taking over and preparing our body for a response to threat. Because, dilated pupils can bring in more light, and so we can see more of what's around us. Our organs, also the digestive process, is also suppressed because we need to conserve that energy to actually run or employ survival tactics. But the other thing is that the prefrontal cortex also steps to the back, because if you are, for example, being chased by a tiger, you don't want to be doing trigonometric equations of the distance between you and that lion. Instead, you want to ensure that your muscles are active and ready to protect you. And that's sort of the response of fight or flight. Now, in a modern society where the risks and the challenges that we face are a little bit different, when they present themselves to us as social constructs and ideas that are not physically dangerous, there's an interesting response, because we still have that same ingrained response to threat, where our prefrontal cortex is subjugated and our emotional regulation, our emotional center is in control. But sometimes what that risk needs is logical thinking. And so what you will find is, if you think about these two domains is that there is an area right outside what we already know that is outside of our current capability, but is near enough our capability that we are able to deal with the risk of trying something new, something that's just out of reach. And that's where optimal growth happens. And the idea that Lev Vygotsky explains, or what he defines that area, is the zone of proximal development, because the best development happens when you're doing something that's slightly outside of your abilities. The interesting thing, if we bring these biological lessons to bear, is that in the area that's outside of our capability, that's high risk, it's governed by the amygdala, the threat detection system. But then in the area that's maybe mastered, our amygdala, our prefrontal cortex can be in control, and that is why it's much easier to do complex calculations in a situation where you're calm, but suddenly you get to an exam and all of the things that you know how to do leave your head. But the interesting thing about the zone of proximal development is if you feel that you are safe, you can operate with the prefrontal cortex because the risk can be reduced. And if we sort of think about how our performance changes in each of these areas, it's actually been supported by two other psychologists. I think it's Yates and Dodson, and they introduced this idea, or they introduced this graph that explains how our performance changes as the pressure of a challenge changes. And what we find is when something is too easy and something is too isn't interesting, we're in this bored stage. Our performance is really low simply because it doesn't capture our interest. And that's that area of mastered knowledge. It's easy for mastered knowledge to feel a little bit boring. And that's why repetitive tasks become harder over time, because they get mastered easily and they no longer require our attention. But as the pressure increases and as the risk increases, we start to get really focused and attentive, because that's when we enter that zone of proximal development. And it's when we're sort of doing things that are of a moderate to high pressure, we perform at our best. That's why a lot of school papers only get written in the last few days, because that is when the pressure has gotten to the right amount. But then there comes that time when the pressure is too much, and then our performance starts to drop again. And this is in some ways another representation of the zone of proximal development and how our performance changes over time. And so the interesting idea that Vygotsky then introduces is this idea of the more knowledgeable other and what the impact that they can have. You see, our zone of proximal development by ourselves, or this area of ideal learning, is very limited because it's suppressed by risk and the amygdala taking over. But with a person that can actually provide safety and provide a sense of learning, what you can do is you can expand the zone of proximal development and encourage optimal learning in areas where they would not be able to learn by themselves. And that's why in each of those frameworks that we're going to look at, there is another person that actually enables the learning. And so we can start with the parent-child relationship, and that's the first one that we'll dive into. How does this idea of the more knowledgeable other actually affect a child's development? So if we were to sort of overlay this onto the zone of what you'll pretty much find is one of the biggest values that a parent can provide is a person who can create a safe space for their child to develop. And in some ways, that's what a pregnancy is. It's a safe space for a child to grow their first 9 months and develop in the ways that they need to develop. And then they are born into the world. But they still need that area of safety. But the area of safety has just grown. And so what a parent can do is, instead of providing the physical safety that a pregnant mother provides, you can provide the psychological safety that a parent and a safe household can provide, and a child can learn. And one of the very interesting things about the parental process is parents actually know instinctually how to teach a child how to talk, because a parent doesn't talk to a child at the vocabulary that they're at that given time. They know instinctually to use phrases and words and ideas that are slightly out of reach, that actually draw the development out of a child. And that's how they learn to talk, because it's not like they've got a manual of talking 101 that a baby can read, and then they sort of randomly download that. Instead, what a parent does is they manage the risk that the child is exposed to. And as you grow up, you get exposed to more risk. But each of these ideas that we're going to look at, each of them has a shortfall. Each of them has an error that actually requires another developmental framework to support it. And that's why we don't only have, the parent-child relationship to actually educate younger humans. And the reason for that is because eventually, when you grow up, one day you will have to realize that there are some things that are outside your parents' domain of mastered knowledge, and they can no longer provide that area of learning. And so, if we almost thought about it, in a narrative framework, we would think about another idea or another sort of developmental relationship that might be able to cover the things that are outside of the current knowledge. And that would bring us to our next one. But before we do, one of the main things that we can learn from the parent-child relationship is the value of fostering a safe environment, one safe enough for a child to explore new challenges. And that's how you enable them to actually learn, grow, and develop. And the next thing that we would look at is guilds and apprenticeships, because this speaks to the challenge that we found with the parent-child relationship. What it typically looked like is you'd have a number of craftspeople or specialists who are good at one specific job and would trade for that job, whether it's through a bartering system or through a currency system, and they would do that one skill and then gain all the other things that they need to live off of. And so by having this network of skilled individuals in different domains, what it enabled you to do is to have people who could mentor or provide that area of development, or allow the apprentice to enter the zone of proximal development in the area that they are a specialist. So by each individual specializing, you create a network of people that can actually provide that relationship. And then you would have a craftsmaster who might take on 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 apprentices. And the interesting thing is there's a challenge that's actually posed by the parent-child relationship that I hadn't mentioned, because there are also those children who don't necessarily have parents in their lives, especially back in the older times when we had a lot of wars and the maternal mortality rate was so high in childbirth. There were many children who didn't actually have parents, and they didn't have people who could create that zone of optimal learning. And so what would happen with guilds and apprenticeship is the apprentice would actually join the household of the master, of the craft master. And by doing that, you actually start to also create a safety net in the fabric of the society that not only enables them to learn a craft, but also have a place to belong. But like the parent-child relationship, guilds and apprenticeship also had their own challenges. And that is, like many other systems of today, they eventually became a political tool. And those that were supposed to enable and empower started to become gatekeepers. And only if you knew the right person could you get the apprenticeship. And so the value of this extremely powerful system started to wane. I mean, during its golden age, the guild system was used in many parts of the world, from Africa to Europe to the Americas. And in a lot of these places, it eventually devolved into corruption and a political tool. But like the parent-child relationship, there is still something valuable to learn. And that is that the barrier to entry for an optimal learning framework or system needs to be as low as possible. Regardless of who I am and where I come from, I need to be able to enter into this learning environment. And that's what we can learn from the guilds and apprenticeships, because they were a way for blood to not necessarily be the thing that ties you to learning. You don't necessarily have to have parents to be able to make a life for yourself. You don't necessarily have to have had a great childhood. Instead, you could find a place that actually fits you and grow and evolve in that area. And that's what we can learn from guilds and apprenticeships. And then we get the modern schooling system now. As I sort of mentioned, I have a bit of a critical view on the modern schooling system. But it might surprise you that I actually think it does a lot of things extremely well. Because what it does very well is that it makes standardized knowledge easily accessible to very, very, very many people. And that is evidenced by the fact that humanity has never been more literate. We've never been more capable in terms of arithmetic. Information has never been as easy to access. And these are all things that have come in part from this modern schooling system. But like the previous two frameworks we've looked at, it had its challenge too. Because would that it were, every single child was exactly the same. But if we were to look at reality, it looks a little bit more like this. Each child is different in the way that they learn, in the way that they develop, in the way that they grow, and in terms of what they actually need to be able to grow. And so the modern schooling system, for all of its woes, has done some things extremely well and others not so much. And so what we can learn from the schooling system is that knowledge that is established should be standardized and should be made open and available. But the thing that where I feel I differ is that I don't think that that's enough. I don't think any one of these can actually solve the problem at hand. Instead, I think we need all of them. But in the modern day, sorry, before I get here, in the modern day, one of the things that's been interesting and quite a tragedy is both the parent-child relationship still exists and this idea of modern schooling. But the idea of having a professional mentor, this idea of the craft master and his apprentices, that to me seems to have been lost, especially with the change from the Industrial Revolution. You know, it was a thing of people sort of being craft specialists and finding their niche and being extremely skilled and passing that information on, to needing a semi-skilled person who could simply work a machine. And that person doesn't necessarily need a specialized person to train them. Instead, they would be trained in a class sort of environment that is very good at scale, but not very good at the individual level. And so I would like to take some of these lessons and just share how we could use them in the relationships that we have today. Because I think with the parent-child relationship, some kind of mentorship framework, and the modern schooling system, I think together, all of those can actually bring us to a place where knowledge is preserved and passed down, but also the younger generation is nurtured and enabled and empowered to solve our modern challenges. And so I think there are three things that we can pick up. The first would be to lead by questioning questions, to encourage autonomy. The next, that growth comes from a high challenge, low threat environment. And also, not to solve problems for a person that is your mentee. And we'll dive into each one of these very briefly. The first is when there's this very interesting thing. You know, I don't know if for those of you who have had a direct report or or somebody that you mentor or somebody even that you're just showing the ropes at your workplace, you know, you might have had sorry, I'm saying if you've had a mentor or somebody else is showing you the ropes at a workplace, you might have had a person who is showing you around, and sometimes they give you some advice you don't necessarily want or need. And then you get other times where a person just gives you a little bit of advice and it suddenly works. And I think that's because when you're mentoring someone, there is a time and a place for advice and a time and a place for questions. Because advice is good when the person is way out of their depth. And by providing advice and sharing stories and showing that you can create an area of safety, you actually build trust. And that's how you foster this idea of psychological safety, because I think we talk about it a lot, but it's not so simple about how to actually bring it into being. But then at the same time, while you're creating psychological safety, you still want to encourage growth. And so what we can do is use questions, because what a question does is it actually forces the mentee to give of themselves and to look into themselves for an answer rather than taking the advice of somebody else. And the interesting thing about that is then it also leans into your own intelligence, and with each question that you answer, you get a little bit more intelligent, and that mastered knowledge actually grows. And that's how the learning mechanism actually takes place in a mentorship relationship. And the second one, which is about creating a high safety, low threat environment. And that is every now and then, for anyone who has had a mentee or a direct report, they come to you with a big challenge, one that's so big that it's out of their current ability. And what we can do is take a leaf out of the psychological literature, specifically in the area of therapy. And so when a good therapist has a client and they present them with a problem, the therapist doesn't tell them how to solve it. Instead, what they do is they take the problem and they break it apart into its constituting pieces. And they through discussion and through questions, find the part that is small enough that the individual is willing to take it on voluntarily. And something very interesting happens when they do that. Because when they take it on voluntarily, it now becomes a matter both of intrinsic motivation and encouraging autonomy, because they are the ones who are actually taking this problem on themselves. And so not only do you solve the problem, you also show them how to actually solve the problem by breaking it down into its constituting parts. And so we can do that as well when we are working with someone who is dealing with a big problem. Sometimes it's even so big that we don't know what to do. And in those cases, instead of trying to give an answer, we can simply, through a conversation, help the person break the problem down and address it piece by piece. Because what happens when you do that is with each challenge that you resolve, not only do you build your confidence, your area of knowledge grows, and that zone of proximal development slightly expands. And by doing that, you make the person more capable and more knowledgeable. And lastly, one of the things that we should do, and I've already spoken a little bit about this, is the three zones of that a mentor has responsibility. In the area outside of outside of their domain of capability, even with help, we create safety. In the zone that's outside of their ability, but that they can do, or they might be able to do, we want to allow for failure and show that it is safe to fail so that they are willing to step outside that domain of mastered knowledge and grow. But in the area that is mastered, we should encourage them to be a mentor for somebody else. Because what you do when you do that is you allow them to create an engaging environment in an area that's typically maybe a little bit more boring. And by taking another person on, you enable them to both not only refresh their mastered knowledge, but also pass that knowledge on to the next person. And by doing that, we create a network of mentors that are teaching each other and passing the knowledge through the fabric of social relationships. And the great thing about the mentorship relationship is it crosses all borders, because there are people in the same country, in the same company that mentor each other. There are people in different companies that have mentorship relationships. There are people in different countries. And so what we can then do is actually allow the information to permeate the culture as a whole. And so I think with these three things, we can do a lot of good. The first is to lead with questions, to allow your mentee to actually grow and to look into themselves for the answer. The second is to break challenges down into the constituting parts until the individual that we're mentoring is willing to take on the smallest or the largest possible one voluntarily. And lastly, we don't solve problems for our mentees. Instead, we create a domain of safety, encourage them to step outside of their current abilities, and create an environment that is safe for failure. And lastly, avoid solving problems for them so that they can actually do it for themselves and learn and grow. And so, I'd like you to take one more deep breath and imagine. Imagine one more time that there you stand in the city square, looking over a sea of faces, and they all have their eyes on you and hang on your every word. For surely you are the greatest thinker to have walked the earth. And you have dedicated your entire life to the growth and nurturing of the youth of Athens. And one fateful day, those that call themselves your enemies charge you with the most heinous crime, corrupting the youth of Athens. And now, in the modern day, that may seem like a trivial offense. But in ancient Greece, that was a crime punishable by death. And so, in your final days, as you think over your life, you think back before the death of Socrates on the one mentee that you picked up, your one student, your apprentice, who followed you religiously, listening to your every word, capturing your every conversation. And you know that you can rest easy, knowing that the knowledge of Socrates and the idea of Socratic dialogue would live on, and it would become the foundational mechanism for learning and education today. And so, I'd like you now to think about a different path. Think about a problem. Think about a domain of mastered knowledge where you could decide to venture out into the unknown and create a path that someone can follow you into. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alfi. That was really great. Do we have any questions from the YouTube side? It doesn't seem like anyone is posting any questions. I have something I'd like to ask.
Yes.
At my company, for the first time ever, we are implementing a mentorship an internship program next year.
Amazing.
And we want to see that as mentorship being the foundational kind of guiding force behind that it's not we just have a bunch of bodies that come and sit in the office and get some experience or something. How would you recommend structuring something like that? From what I've been thinking about is that we have interns actively working on a team on a project, but that they also work on a project together. That's just an internal type of bit of work that we set for them. And then they have each intern has a mentor assigned to them. Do you think that's a reasonably good approach in order to gain all the great kinds of things you've been mentioning?
That's a great question. I'd say there's two parts to it, because in some ways, and I think this is one of the reasons I'm really passionate about this space, is that that's almost two different problems, because there is the problem of developing the mentee, but then there's also the challenge of developing the mentor. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of companies get wrong. So while I used to work at ABSA some time back, about a year ago, and so they also had a graduate program, and they had a similar kind of idea. They had a set of graduates, They'd join the company and they'd work on a project together, but each of them had a person that they would speak to. But the challenge that they would sort of speak to as like a person that's experienced in the team, usually like a
Yeah.
mid or junior level person. The challenge comes in is not a lot of people actually know what's expected of them as a mentor. So what ends up happening is you get a certain amount of value almost through osmosis by speaking to a person that's more experienced in the company. So that is
Right.
valuable to do. It's definitely better than nothing. It's
Mm-hmm.
100% better than nothing. But the challenge is often the mentor doesn't know how to engage. And that's one of the things that I've spent quite a bit of time working on, sort of building like almost like a handbook, a
Mm-hmm.
mentor's handbook of just what's
Mm-hmm.
expected of you and how to go about
Yeah.
it. And so what I would say is if you wanted to do that, you'd typically want to engage with the mentors probably 2 to 3 weeks at least before the mentees join, and
Right.
just give
Yeah.
them an idea of what's expected of them, because
Mm-hmm.
we sometimes think that because you've now got the title of a mentor, you suddenly know everything and you're suddenly going to turn into like a master Yoda who's just going to drop knowledge all the time.
Yeah.
But it's actually a little bit harder than that. And so what I'd say is you want to give them it can even just be like an hour or two a week
Mm-hmm.
in those 3 weeks leading up, and just give them an idea of what's expected of them. You're not expected to, for example, you're not expected to do work for them or show them where to find the answers to their questions, but you might be
Yes. Yes.
expected to make sure that they are coping as an individual in a workplace. They know where the bathroom is and so on. And by creating
Yeah.
those guidelines or just setting that expectation, you actually enable the mentor to help the best way they can.
Mm.
Because one of the things that also happens sometimes is you get the mentor who over explains, and then the person doesn't necessarily um, gain that sense of autonomy. Or you get the
Mm-hmm.
person who doesn't want to feel like they're micromanaging, who is like too aloof and too
Yeah.
separate. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but by giving them like an idea of how to approach it, you give them a middle ground and you give them, in some sense, the expectation, and then they can deal with that how they see fit.
Right. Great.
Yeah, I don't know if that
Thanks.
answers your question.
It definitely does. Thanks. I think the emphasis on the mentor as being as important is a really good one. We got a
Mm.
question from Joshua who asks, where can we find the mentor sphere in South Africa? And he elaborates to say, as in, where can people find mentors in the product field, and where can people
Mm.
offer themselves as mentors? Are there any kinds of things like this around that you know?
So I know for some time, Office Zen had a program. Um, they had a program
Yes, I
where
remember that.
they had a program where developers could volunteer, and then people
Yeah.
coming in through the Office Zen mentorship program would be matched up. I think they have put that on pause for the time being, and they're doing something that's more like an open source mentor sort of platform, so where people can share knowledge, share things that they've learned about mentorship, and people can also go there to connect with mentors as far as I'm aware. So there's that. There are probably a couple of platforms now. Because I'm a designer, I know the design ones. For
Yes.
example, ADP List is one of the ones that exist, but I'm sure there would probably be a couple for the developer space as well. A thing that I would say, and this is probably the challenge that a lot of people looking for mentors would find, is that it's more likely that you're not going to have a place where you can find a person who is a dedicated mentor. And so my older brother, his name's Alex, introduced me to a fantastic idea called the what is it? I think the mentorship Voltron, if I'm not mistaken. And it's basically this idea of, instead of finding one person who you hang your entire mentorship needs on, instead you break your needs down into pieces. Maybe what you need is a little bit of mentorship around, presenting your ideas and doing presentations. And then you also need a little bit of help in the space of career development. And then you also need a little
Mm.
bit of help maybe in terms of parenting. Those don't have to be the same person. Instead, what you can do is you can have a series of mentors, and mentors in specific areas. Because the other thing that you get that's also really valuable about doing that is that you also then set the foundation of what's expected of that mentor. Because if I just come to you and I say, hey, will you be my mentor? It's like, okay, what does that mean? Like, am I helping you raise your children, or am I just teaching you how to do something? And so by actually breaking your needs down into individual elements, you can actually then have different mentors. And the thing that's also great about that is then the load on the mentor is also much less, because they are only expected to help you in one small space, and then they can actually give of their time with a person that's typically maybe a little bit more busy than that. And that's how
Right.
I'd approach that.
Great. Yeah, that's really good advice. For people in the code space, I can tell that We Think Code, if you join their program, you will be placed in a mentorship and / internship role with one of their partner companies. Yeah, so for the developers, there are those kinds of things out there that I'm aware of, and yeah, I think there's also quite a lot of kind of informal support networks around various communities. Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, I see Mitch, Mish or Mitch. I'm not sure which one. In the comments, they just mentioned ADP list that you also mentioned.
Yeah,
Alfi.
it's a fantastic one. And
Yeah.
I mean, there's actually another community. So it's more product people, than so like product managers and so on. But it's called. Hold on, give me 2 seconds. I can't forget this. Product School. That's
Product
right.
school.
And they've got a Slack channel. They've got a Slack channel, and there are a lot of people, and they're from in vast different areas. So like there's people from Uber in the US, there's people from companies in Europe, people from India, all sorts of places are on there, and you can just reach out to them. I think they've got like a weekly Ask Me Anything session with different
Great.
professionals. So that's a fantastic resource to use. Like I've been on a couple of those every now and then to get some of my questions answered.
Okay. Yeah, I've just popped the link
Yeah.
there in the chat. People.
Amazing.
Okay. If there aren't any more questions, and I don't think there are, just left to me to thank you so much for fantastic talk. Really amazing. Yeah, I can't wait to watch it again. There's so much in it, and really great. And yeah, thanks for answering the questions. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. YouTube usually takes around 24 hours to do all the encoding and all of that, and then it's available again to watch. We'll share the link as soon as that's done in the ZA product development Slack channel, Slack instance, and yeah, please share far and wide if you've attended, because I really think we need to be sending this message to as many people as we possibly can. Yeah. Alfi, if you'll just stay for a minute, I'm going to end the broadcast. So thanks, everyone. And
just
thanks
one last thing. If anyone
sorry.
has any questions in the future, feel free to reach out to me. I'm extremely extroverted, so I don't need a very good excuse to set up a Zoom call or meet you for coffee.
Okay, great. I'm sure people will hold you to that. Great. Thanks.
Amazing.
Thanks, everyone.